Friends, the West imposed sanctions, but Russia responded in such a way that the world froze in anticipation. Assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, the departure of giants like Pepsi and Danone, exit taxes and confiscations. Is this the beginning of a new economic war or a step towards a global restructuring of the world order? Let's look at how Putin's latest decree changes the rules of the game and who will win in the end. Do not switch, it will be hot. RIA Novosti reports that the West risks losing assets worth at least $300 billion if frozen Russian assets are confiscated. The question is whether the recent sanctions imposed by the European Union and the United States were a big mistake. This aggressive step towards Russia may turn into a retaliatory blow. Russia responded to the sanctions by imposing its own measures, and even went further by seizing Western assets and businesses, including those of American companies. On December 28, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a response to another package of sanctions imposed by the West. The document lists the consequences that will be implemented as retaliatory measures against the United States and the EU. What does this mean for both sides of the conflict and how will they react to these steps? Let's get this straight. On December 16, 2024, the European Union published a package of economic restrictions. The purpose of these measures is to further isolate Russia both economically and politically. However, Putin's government has responded with countermeasures that are estimated to affect assets of more than $280 billion worth of Western companies located in Russia. Thus, the geopolitical tension between the United States, the EU, and Russia is reaching a new level. How will this affect both sides of the conflict? I'll tell you now. Interestingly, the West is significantly ahead of Russia in terms of frozen assets. According to recent estimates, Western countries have blocked about $300 billion belonging to the Russian central bank and other entities. These funds are deposited in various financial institutions around the world, including euros and the United States. The main part is concentrated in European banks, where about 2.7 billion euros are stored. In second place are American banks, where funds worth $67 billion are blocked. The UK has also contributed by blocking assets or engaging in international financial transactions, making them easily accessible for identification and blocking by Western governments acting in a coordinated manner. But these are not only reserves, but also the personal assets of Russian oligarchs. Yachts, luxury real estate, and private jets were confiscated. For example, Germany took from Alisher Usmanov a yacht worth $750 million and his property worth $90 million on the island of Jersey. In Italy, $7 billion of Roman Abramovich's investments were frozen. France and Spain also confiscated property and yachts of Russian elites totaling about $58 billion. The West is actively using harsh sanctions and legal instruments to freeze assets linked to Russia, coordinating its actions through a task force called REPO, Russian elites, proxies, and oligarchs. These measures were taken in order to track and confiscate Russian wealth located abroad. Banks play a key role in identifying and blocking funds according to national legislation. If we compare the two sides, then the advantage is clearly on the side of the West. The frozen assets of $300 billion belonging to the Central Bank of Russia, as well as the confiscated $58 billion, significantly exceed the assets that Russia can control on its territory. But that didn't stop the Kremlin. In July 2024, a decree was passed legalizing the confiscation of Western assets in Russia. However, despite this, Russia is facing certain difficulties. Assets worth $300 billion are frozen in the West, while Western assets in Russia are distributed across various sectors and companies, making their capture difficult, but not impossible. That is why the West takes this threat seriously. Russia has taken a tough stance in response to Western sanctions. The Kremlin's strategy is aimed at making life as difficult as possible for Western companies operating in the Russian market. If the company decides to leave Russia, it is obliged to sell its assets with significant losses. In addition, the so-called exit tax was introduced, which was increased from 15% to 35% in October 2024. This step is clearly aimed at hitting the pockets of foreign companies and at the same time replenishing the Russian budget. But that's not all. Western companies face severe restrictions on withdrawing their profits from Russia, which further limits their financial freedom and makes it difficult to repatriate income. Russia seeks to keep money inside its economy rather than allow it to flow to Western markets. This approach, although it complicates the work of foreign companies, is also aimed at trying to stabilize the Russian economy in the face of global instability. Many major players were under attack. For example, Carlsberg, a leading beer producer, faced strict government control and was obliged to sell its assets at large discounts, which led to enormous financial losses. The situation is no better for the French food giant Danone, which is caught in the crossfire of sanctions. The restriction on the export of profits from the country has become a real headache for the company, hampering its global operations. In December 2024, Danone's business in Russia was fully transferred to a Russian entrepreneur, completing the company's transition under Russian control. The situation also raises a question. Despite continuing to operate in Russia, companies cannot transfer profits outside the country, which puts them in an extremely difficult position. Shell had similar problems, having invested billions of dollars in the Russian oil and gas sector and now had to leave the market without withdrawing assets. At the same time, Renault, which was an important player in the Russian automotive market, also found itself in a difficult situation. Sanctions not only restrict the activities of companies, but also force them to change their strategies in the face of geopolitical instability. For example, Unilever was forced to sell its Russian plants at a loss. Siemens, a major technology supplier to Russia, is also facing the threat of confiscation of its investments or taxation, which complicates its situation. But friends, this is the latest news. Russia is forcing foreign companies to sell their assets at huge losses. And this is not just a business move, but a strategic counterattack. Moscow makes it clear that if the West freezes Russian reserves, Russia will take away Western companies in response. This confrontation between the world powers is reaching a new level, and one of the main examples is the Dutch financial giant ING Bank. In January 2025, ING sold its Russian business to Global Development, a Moscow-based firm owned by an investor with expertise in factoring services. Although the exact sale price was not disclosed, it was undoubtedly at a large discount. It wasn't a voluntary withdrawal. The Russian authorities have made it clear that Western companies will not be allowed to simply leave the Russian market. Financial losses for ING are expected to be significant. The net loss from the transaction will amount to approximately 700 million euros, of which about 400 million is the difference between the market value of the business and the sale price. In addition, ING has also lost 315 million euros since 2022 due to the depreciation of the ruble, which affected its capital. However, this loss exists only on paper and does not threaten the stability of the bank. For Russia, this is a strategic victory. She is forcing a large Western bank to sell assets for next to nothing. After this deal, ING plans to further reduce its ties with Russia. As of September 30, 2024, its remaining debt to Russian customers amounts to 1 billion euros, of which 500 million are insured under guarantees from export credit agencies. Another major loss for Europe is related to the Austrian Raiffeisen Bank International. A Russian court ordered him to pay 2 billion euros in compensation for the failed deal. This decision was perceived as a direct response to Western financial sanctions. The bank, which was one of the largest Western lenders in Russia, is now facing serious financial problems. Thus, Russia demonstrates that it does not intend to remain passive in response to the sanctions. She is actively using her leverage to retaliate against Western companies, forcing them to withdraw from the Russian market with huge losses. This confrontation continues to gain momentum, and its consequences could be long-term for both Russia and the West. Ultimately, sanctions undermine investor confidence in Russia, which can lead to lower foreign investment and disruption of supply chains in key sectors. Russian economic measures aimed at maximizing self-sufficiency and avoiding foreign investment have far-reaching consequences that go beyond the local economy. These steps may cause long-term changes in the global economy, forcing companies and countries to adapt to instability and increased control in Russia. Economic turmoil at home is expected to have an impact on international markets, and Russia's strengthening in response to sanctions is only exacerbating relations with the West, creating a harbinger of further escalation. President Vladimir Putin said that Russia has become economically stronger thanks to the sanctions, stressing that Russia has learned how to circumvent Western restrictions and develop domestic markets. However, such a strategy may lead to increased geopolitical isolation, which jeopardizes long-term economic growth and may cause stagnation in a number of sectors. The confrontation with the West continues to gain scale, and each new economic decision only increases the risk of a global economic war. The European Union has already launched a strategic counteroffensive aimed at protecting its companies from financial losses and legal risks. The measures taken, such as the ban on the execution of court orders in the EU, are designed to limit Russia's ability to influence European assets. However, despite the EU's efforts, the long-term consequences remain questionable. An increase in tensions may not only affect the economies of Russia and the EU, but also affect other countries, especially those in the global south. Sanctions and retaliatory measures undermine business confidence with the West, and foreign investors may reconsider their strategies. This raises an important question about how this conflict will develop in the coming years and how countries will rethink their economic and geopolitical strategies in the face of instability. Let's take a look at how the sanctions situation unfolded with Trump's arrival in the White House. Western banks have begun discussing the possibility of lifting sanctions against Russia after Donald Trump's election victory, the source said. Experts are considering the terms and conditions under which restrictions can be lifted after the U.S. elections. Conversations among bank traders focused on one question: is it possible to lift sanctions against Russia? In particular, bankers are interested in the possibility of resuming ruble trading. However, many believe that such a scenario is unlikely at the moment. Discussions are underway among those who are interested in lifting sanctions, including large companies and governments. However, no official statements on this topic have been made yet in Europe or the United States. The lifting of sanctions can only become possible in the context of future negotiations, during which a peaceful settlement of the conflict will be discussed. At this stage, the issue of lifting sanctions may become a tool to make the peace treaty more attractive to Russia. However, according to experts, such a process will take a long time. It is likely that serious steps to lift sanctions, mainly from Europe, will not take place before 2025. American relations with Russia are likely to remain tense, and new sanctions against Russia are not expected, as most industries have already been subject to restrictive measures. Friends, now I would like to express my opinion on the material. To be honest, this whole economic conflict resembles a game of tug-of-war, where both sides are only pushing harder. The West is trying to pin Russia down with sanctions, freezing billions and turning out the pockets of companies. And Russia responds symmetrically by taking Western corporations out of the game and imposing high taxes on their businesses. And you know what? The situation is turning into an endless cycle of mutual blows, where ordinary people and businesses on both sides are suffering. The West has clearly underestimated Russia's ability to adapt. No one is going to sit idly by here. Russia has already proved that it can find the answer. Yes, sanctions are hitting the economy, but it will not be possible to close the country behind an iron curtain in the 21st century. Every billion frozen abroad becomes an incentive for the development of the domestic market. Every pressure on corporations only pushes them to find new solutions. And ultimately, this makes Russia stronger. But the West also seems to be trapped by its own politicians. I would like to ask, is the game worth the candle? Instead of wasting energy on this economic Armageddon, the parties could sit down at the negotiating table and find a compromise. After all, it is obvious that Russia will not break under the pressure of sanctions, no matter how much the EU and the United States dream. But the West is unlikely to be able to indefinitely ignore the trillions that remain inaccessible. The world must be smarter and look for ways to dialogue, because otherwise we are heading for a dead end, where all parties will have to consider not only losses, but also losses of reputation on the world stage. Be sure to write your opinion on the material, friends. I read all the comments. I also want to thank you very much for your attention. See you.